Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Prism of Perspective podcast. And today I'm really excited to introduce you to a friend of mine, Alan Neese, who I've known for better than 15 years. And what has always stood out to me about Alan is his warmth and his clear commitment to growth and to thinking win-win. He's just one of those people that, I see him in the gym and I see him around and he just always has a great smile and inviting nature. And so we've remained, good acquaintances during that time. And as of late, we've gotten back into a closer relationship. And I really wanted to bring him by because, again, what we like to do here is have a conversation with people who have created lives where they're thriving. And we want to be able to look at their lives and consider, how did they make that happen? What were the motivating forces? What were their beliefs that enabled them to create that? So to give you a little bit of background on Alan, he's married for 32 years and he has 3 adult children, all of whom live here in the Palm Beach Gardens area. He's been in the financial services industry for a long time. For the first 5 years, he was in banking, or I think maybe the first 8 years he was in banking. And since that time, he's been a financial advisor running his own financial planning team. And, as a way back background, he grew up, and we're going to get into this a little bit. He grew up in a military family. And so as a lot of military family will know, that meant he moved a lot. And so that creates certain circumstances where you have to be able to evolve and adapt. So anyway, with that, I know you're really going to love Alan, and I'm really happy to have him here. So thank you for being here, Alan.
Hey, good to be with you today, John.
Yeah, it's really my pleasure. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at your world, some of the important pivot movements that you've had that gave you the opportunity to have a great family life, to have a great business life, to have a really satisfying spiritual life. And think through what was going on at the time. How did your beliefs support that? Or maybe they had to be shifted in particular ways.
Sure.
And again, I've seen you at the gym for a lot of times, very fit man, right? Takes his fitness pretty seriously, as you guys know, I do as well. And, how does that play in? The idea that you have the energy and vitality. So let's begin way back, right? And talk to me a little bit about the growing up in the military family. So between the time you were born and before you went off, got out of high school, you mentioned that you'd lived in 13 different locations.
That's right. States or countries. 2 of those countries were the Philippines and Japan. So it was quite an adventure. Back then, the military moved families just about every year. So commonly when you get to a new place, you'd have a mindset that I'm here 1 year, I got to make friends fast, but don't put down roots too deep, don't connect too hard, because come June, we're out of here.
Right.
We're going to some completely different place that we have no idea of at this point.
So like almost everything, there's pluses and minuses to those kinds of circumstances. So talk to me first about what do you see as some of the benefits that came from that upbringing?
Sure. For me particularly, it made it easy for me to adapt and assimilate with different cultures. When I would get to a place where I knew nobody, I knew I had to find a way to fit in and connect quickly, or else I was going to be a loner for the duration of the stay there. So me particularly, I jumped right into that. I didn't view that as an obstacle, where in my family of 4 kids, not all of us adapted so well. Mm-hmm.
So when you said fit in, what popped up for me, I'm a big Brene Brown fan, and she talks a lot about belonging and fitting in and the difference there. And the distinction that she makes is that the concept of fitting in, the way that she uses it, not the way you've necessarily used it, is that when we're seeking to fit in, we often give up our true authenticity to find out what is the in culture that I'm trying to meet. Whereas the idea of really belonging is that you have an opportunity to stay connected to your values and that group is accepting. So if you were to kind of think along those lines and those distinctions, where did you feel like maybe you became very adaptable to fitting in? And where was it that, no, there were other guys that were just like me. They were also moving all the time. And so we, in many ways were able to belong. How did that feel for you?
Sure. Well, some of the places we moved, the school that I would go to would be entirely military kids. So it was easy to belong because we were all of the same tribe. And we all had the mindset that we were going to be there for a year, perhaps 2. We had to go along and get along, and we had to do it quickly if we were going to be part of the accepted group. Where other times we were just part of a much larger population of civilians, if I could say it that way.
Yep.
And we were the odd group. So the military kids tended to stick together because we were the outsiders. And in some of the places I lived, the communities weren't really welcoming to the military kids. You know, we were a necessary evil in their community, but they knew we were only there short term, so there wasn't any eagerness on their part to connect with us and to develop friendships.
Right. It was almost like you had to do all the work, right?
Yes. Yeah, you had to. And for me, really from the time I was 12 on through high school, participating in sports was my connection point. So even if I had nothing else in common with people, we played on the same football team or the same wrestling team or the same track team.
I did not move much as a child, but I had one major move, which in some ways probably was not more significant, but differently significant, right? So when I was 11, my parents had gotten divorced and we moved from Jersey down to Jensen Beach, Florida.
Big change.
Big change, right? In so many ways. It was really very, very different. I'd come from a different type of community and came into and landed in a place that was very different. And it was much more difficult for my sister to adapt than it was for me because I was fairly athletic. And like you said, you know, all of a sudden it was like lunchtime. Okay, I'm going to pick this kid anyway, right? He's new, but he's fast. And so I think that, you know, for some of us that, you know, making that adaptation or even just kind of thinking about like, where are the places, what are the things that we have that add value to the community we're entering? Maybe a really good mindset to have, right?
Sure.
How do you think that might help you today, right? So you have this foundational adaptation, you know, meeting people, comfort. How has that evolved and benefited you throughout your life?
Well, what's interesting, especially in the times we're living in, is growing up, most of my friends were minorities because that's who was participating in the military.
Right.
You know, whether they're Black or Hispanic, what have you. So for me to be connected or to be accepting of other races was never a problem because that's how I grew up. Right. So today, such a big thing is made of it. It's always been my way of living. You know, it was never a hindrance, but having to adapt and, you know, kind of fit in and be accepted has made it easy for me in the financial services world because no matter who I'm meeting, no matter what their ethnicity or their background or what their belief systems, I've kind of been there before to some degree. I've had to fit in with people different than myself. So it comes naturally for me now. I'm not intimidated. I'm not in any way threatened by people with different backgrounds than myself.
Right. That's
comes
very
easy.
Yeah, that's very cool. So there's a couple different areas of the belief system when I talk about it inside the prism that we look at. The first one of those is identity beliefs. And identity beliefs I break down into like, what is your purpose? What's your vision? What are your values? And what are your gifts? Like, what are you going to bring to the world? And the way I look at it from there is that our identity beliefs kind of act as a thermostat in our life, right? We're going to show up pretty similarly to the way we see ourselves showing up. So you had this foundation of, I see myself as someone who's really adaptable. Right. There's my vision of who I am is I'm accepting, I'm open, right?
Sure.
I'm connecting. I value humanity, right?
Absolutely.
And so those things all came in to serve the greater purpose that you continue to live today. Speak to me about a little more of the overarching purpose when you think about your life. I know that your spirituality is really important to you, but let's even get away from you have a particular faith that you follow. You're a Christian, a strong Christian, and it has really served you very, very well. And with that, like when you think about that, what are the values that you're really living out when you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, even before having Christian faith, I had my mom as an example. My mom was always as we jokingly say, the neighborhood do-good lady. She was always looking for somebody to help. And it's really reflective of her own Catholic upbringing and kind of the demand placed on service to those less fortunate. So I can remember growing up where, we were feeding homeless people just because that's what we did. It wasn't that we were trying to win the approval of somebody else. Right. That was just life. My mom took in so many people that were down and out. And if they didn't wind up in our home, they wound up in a position where she was taking care of them. So I saw that. I participated in it. At the time, of course, when you're a kid, you don't want any of it. You just want to be a kid and you want to go do fun things. But I see that in my adulthood, that really informed my own desire to constantly serve others and be a help to somebody in need.
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I love that. And I know you've shared with me there are people today that, your commitment and your heart for service has you, one, obviously having great impact on those that are open and willing.
Right.
And also has you having faith in people's ability to change, even when they may not be demonstrating that, and kind of your fortitude around that. Tell me a little more about that.
Sure. Well, one of the best models of change I've ever experienced is me. Prior to becoming a Christian and really connecting with the teachings of the Christian faith, I was a drug addict for 13 years. And it was as though the page of the book turned and then I was not. And I've never gone back. I've never been tempted to go back to any of that. So I look and I think, if I could change as deep in the doo-doo as I was, then these other people can change too, if they have a willingness, if they're open to maybe ideas they haven't explored before.
Right.
Because for myself, for years, people had presented ideas to me about how to, quote unquote, get my act together, and I rejected them all.
Right.
Until I came to the right time in my life where I was open to it. I knew the path I was on wasn't satisfying. It was destructive. And so now I look and I say, if I can change and I'm open to helping others change, if they're open to it. If somebody doesn't want to change, you can't change them. As parents, we know this with our kids.
Right. Everyone has their own kind of place that they're headed. But like you, as anyone's listening, I always say I'm like the least anonymous alcoholic on the planet. But when I, like you, I started drinking when I was 14 and I drank pretty alcoholically, completely alcoholically till I was 29 and I got sober. And, so when people say, people don't really change, when I look back at that time, I don't know if you have this, sure. I recognize that it was me, but it is so different in so many ways. And I don't know about you, but I also look back at it and think, because I also go back before then, and I think about who I was before then. And I think that period of time in there was really about fitting in some ways,
sure.
Right? Trying to fit in a place where I was feeling really uncomfortable and not really know what to do, and then fitting in, but not even really knowing how to do that well. But it's almost like that intermittent period, there was a completely different value set and almost like no overarching purpose.
Sure.
It was just through the day. And again, when I say alcoholic, and I'm not trying to diminish it at all, it wasn't like I was under the bridge.
Right.
I was showing up. I went to college. Sure. I had jobs. I did things along those lines. But, the progress, there was really no progress.
Right.
There were like little check boxes you did. You were like, look, I got through college. Look, I did this. I had a job. But I wasn't evolving.
Exactly.
Sure. And so I think it's a, interesting perspective to look back and say, what were my core drivers then? Like, what was it? Do you have any connection to that? Can you go back there?
Well, in examining why I was basically a functioning pothead for 13 years, it's a thing. I wasn't happy with myself. I had a very poor self-image, and I had the messages I was giving during childhood that you're not as smart as your sister, you're not as athletic as your brother, you're never going to amount to anything, you're a screw up. And during school, for most of the years, I was the class clown. That's how I drew attention to myself. That's how I gained acceptance from people. And so in adulthood, those messages just kept coming back to me that you are a screw up. You're never going to amount to anything. I didn't complete college. You know, you're not a finisher. You're not a leader.
Right.
You know, and so.
Which is so different than who you really are, right? I mean, it's.
Right. Once you get the distractions, the troubles out of the way, whether it's alcoholism or in my case, addiction, you know, now the true you has a chance to come through.
Right. How do you think, I know obviously your Christian faith played a big role in it. What was it, the only influence that really helped you shift your self-perception? What do you think really helped that?
No, I think it was the biggest. I'd have to give careful thought to, was it the only, but it was the biggest influence, because when I first came to the Lord and I started reading the Bible, somebody said to me, do you realize that if you were the only human being who ever lived, he would have been willing to go to the cross and pay for your sins just for you? And I suddenly thought, wow, I have value and worth. Is this really true? And of course, the teaching of the Bible reinforced it. And I met people that had even more screwed up lives than me, who had gotten on the right side of things.
Right.
So I bought into it, lock, stock, and barrel. Really, when I came to the Lord, the first thing I asked is, I said, if you really are God, and I'm still dubious, I'm going to ask you to take away my desire to get high. And if you do that, it'll prove to me you're real. Well, it went away.
Yeah.
I used to, and I've told you this personally, for that 13-year period, I was high every single day, all day.
Right.
You know, I was a banker, and I would go out at lunch and get high and, you know, use my Visine and my cologne to mask it. Right.
All our little mechanisms that we use to try and like hide the fact that our lives are out of control.
That's right. Exactly. But when I no longer had any desire to get high, instead I wanted to be really focused in and dialed into whatever I was doing. It was a revelation to me. It was almost shocking to me, because I hadn't been that guy for 13 years.
Right. And it's kind of fun when you like,
oh my gosh,
at some level, I talk about this with some friends of mine, and so I've been married for 27 years. And so I got married, but I was dating the same girl when I was still drinking that I'm married to. And then we didn't marry for a few years, and I still really hadn't gotten my shit together in my mind, you know, hadn't. And I sometimes look back on it, I'm like, what the hell is she thinking? I think it turned out well for her. I think it turned out she was able to see something, but at the time, you know, I still really hadn't put together the consistency and, you know, but it's almost like, you know, when you start to have other people that see, you know, somebody that you look at and go, oh, that person's amazing. And all of a sudden they're thinking you're amazing.
Right.
It starts to give you that, well, maybe there's more here. Right.
Sure.
And so one of the things I think is really important, and I know you really pay attention to this a lot, is recognizing that we have the opportunity to be those people in so many people's lives, right?
Oh, yes.
Either if it's a big, you know, a big contribution and we have really deeply in their lives, or really just taking a moment. And you had shared with me a story about an impact you had on a family, with a young girl, you know, over dinner. Yes. And how years later, tell me a little more about that. I think that's such a cool story.
Well, it was a Hispanic couple who had a teenage daughter who had gotten hooked on drugs. And I could relate to it.
Yep.
I'd been there, got free of it. And I shared, and in addition, I had a brother who was a year younger than me who went down that same path. And I saw what turned his life around as well. And so we were traveling together because our sons played on the same travel basketball team. And at lunch one day, at a table of 20 adults, they started, for whatever reason, pouring out their heart to me about their daughter. And so I gave them counsel based on what I had experienced, what others had experienced. And I just went on. I didn't even think about it afterwards, but I knew that's what worked.
Right.
Because I had walked that out. And years passed and hadn't seen him, heard from him. And honestly, I didn't even know him at that time.
Right.
They were just one of the many families that were part of this team. And I went to an event that a couple hundred people attended. And before the event started, this couple came up to me and said, thank you so much. The advice you gave us has changed everything. And honest to goodness, I had no idea who they were. I didn't recognize their faces. I couldn't place them. My brain was going overdrive to figure out who they were because I didn't want it to seem inconsequential to me.
Right.
And then when I just couldn't place them, I said, remind me of the advice I gave you.
Right.
And as soon as they said the first sentence, I remembered the whole thing. My memory went back to that scene in Applebee's in Miami. I remembered every detail of it then. And they were expressing that even though the advice I was giving them seemed harsh, it was hard, a tough way to deal with their daughter, they did it. And she came out of addiction, and she was this fruitful, wonderful citizen, and everything had changed in their lives. So that was an example, like we talk about sowing seeds.
Yeah.
It's just somebody in passing that you can share either a kind word with or some advice with. I remember when my son and I spent a great deal of time together because for 10 years he was in AAU basketball. So we traveled all over the country together. And one time we were in a Burger King drive-through. And after we got our food and pulled through, he said, Dad, why do you have to talk to everybody? I said, what do you mean? He goes, just give them the order, just give them the money, and let's go. And I said, but David, you got to realize this person is doing really bad. It's hard work. It's
monotonous, right?
Monotonous. There's no money in it, no gratitude in it. If I, in a few words, can brighten somebody's day with kindness, why would I not do that?
Right.
And what's really so cool, is such a blessing, is I've had adults tell me that's exactly how he is.
Oh, that's awesome.
People who have interacted with him, but then now, oh, this is your dad? Let me tell you about your son. He always has a kind word for everybody, even strangers. And I thought, isn't that wonderful how that was transferred to him?
I love that. And again, that's one of the things that when I was sharing at the beginning, that's what you have done even for me, like bring in a kind word or bringing back something of a contribution, things along those lines.
Sure.
So I love that for you. So let's move a little forward, right? Sure. So then we talked a little bit about the drug addiction, and so that was kind of your 20s, I'm getting, right?
That's right, exactly.
And so you were married at the beginning of that.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't married till after that.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So you're a little older than I thought.
Yes.
How old are you today?
65.
65. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. He looks great.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then you were married a few years after that, if I'm doing the math right?
Right. Sure. Exactly right.
And tell me, like, how did getting married and having kids, how has that impacted the way you see yourself and kind of your identity beliefs?
Honestly, that's the best of us, because whether we like it or not, we're going to become our parents, right? So that tells us we have the opportunity as parents to mold the next generation. But I had been, to use the AA word, I had been sober for a while. Once I came to the Lord, never did drugs or alcohol again after that. And I met my wife about a year later. And within a year, from our first date, we got married 11 months later. And in that time, I had this need to cleanse myself of all this, to tell her what a bad person I was. And she would always say, I just thank God you got all that out of your system before we met.
Right.
And then we got married. It was just, in my mind, storybook. It just was so wonderful with her. And then kids came a couple of years later, and our our plan, our goal from the time we were dating was once we had kids and she'd be a stay-at-home mom. And in financial services, you have the ability to make a very good living if you put in the work. And I was willing to work 6 days a week to make that happen. I wanted her to devote all her time and attention to raising our kids. Yeah. And that's just a very big contribution to how good they are today, is that mom was right there with them. So they were getting the best of her. I hope the best of me. Certainly.
Sounds like your son picked up some good stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They turn out they're really good citizens. You know what I mean? They're just people that other people feel good about. So us getting married and me being able to do that as a person, not addicted to any vices or anything that would deter from the marriage relationship. I had this ring when we got engaged. I bought this ring a size too small on purpose, my wedding band. And I said to my wife, she says, "Why are you getting it small?" I said, "So I'm never tempted to take it off." And I said, in our relationship, I'm never going to use the word divorce. Instead, anytime we encounter problems, we're going to commit to work through them. We're going to resolve problems, not run from them. Because my life before was running from problems, getting high and escaping.
Right. So let's dive a little bit to the backside of the pyramid, just kind of thinking about what you're talking about there, right? So the backside of the pyramid is all about being present, right? And the way I break that down is self-awareness, self-control, empathy or situational awareness, and then influence, right? And so when you say, we're not going to talk about divorce, we're going to discuss these things. And one of the challenges for a lot of people is that they get triggered and they don't have a mechanism, they don't have the self-awareness or self-control to actually be present enough to engage, right? So if you're triggered, what's going on in your brain is you get into self-preservation, right?
Sure.
Which is often either running or attacking.
Yes.
Neither of which makes for a great relationship. So how do you manage that space between stimulus and response so you're able to do that effectively?
Sure. Well, let's look at the early years of marriage and today. So certainly with the passage of time, what used to be big things are really nothing. You know, you learn the truth of you may win the battle, but lose the war. And now I'm focused on not even trying to win the battle or the war, better to go along and get along in a marriage relationship, because in the moment, the stuff that stirs you and gets you on edge, it's all going to pass so quickly. At the time, you think, oh, this is life or death. I'm making my stand on this hill. She's going to know and do it my way. And you just learn there's just no life in that.
Right.
Better to understand that it's all small stuff. You know the saying, don't sweat the small stuff.
And P.S. It's all small
stuff. Yeah. And I say to my wife and others, unless there's a C in the next word, cancer, it's all small stuff.
Right.
And it's all going to pass. And we're going to look back. Like we look back, my wife and I have just the greatest friendship. We just laugh and joke and have so much fun together, and we can go deep with each other. And we look back on the stuff in those early years and we just laugh at how really meaningless it was. Right. But at the moment, we'd get all riled up.
Right. So what I think is great to hear here, again, people don't change. People evolve, right? We gain skills and capabilities and awareness. We get more connected to what really matters. Right. We maybe get more secure in ourselves. So we're not always ego protecting, right? At the beginning, you're kind of ego protecting because like, this is who I am. When you're like, no, it's a belief you have, right? It's a perception you have at the moment. But I want to also kind of go on a little phrase you used, and then something that was a little different in the way you described it. And I just want to get clarity on this. So sometimes when people say go along to get along, it appears as if they're saying, it can appear as if they're saying kind of like let go of the convictions, you know.
Sure.
But then you said we can have really deep conversations.
Sure.
And so when I think about that, it's the idea like I'm not going to fight the small battles, but I have the meaningful conversations, right?
Sure.
You don't allow the conversations to go away. you seek clarity. You allow, I'm guessing, you allow one another's perspectives to be shared in that space, right?
Yes. Yeah.
In the moment, it might be, I'm going to protect, peace right now but in order to really grow a deep relationship, you have to be able to have those deep conversations.
Yes.
Right. So,
and timing is so important, because at the moment, one person maybe is more passionate than the other person about an issue. And an example is last night, my wife described for me in great detail how she wants to remodel the master bedroom bathroom, which I think is perfectly fine, right?
Yep.
So I could see her passion. I see she thought it out in great detail. I listened to all of it. And I said, that's really something to think about. And we have a handyman who works on our house from time to time, and he's coming over today, as a matter of fact. And I said, why don't we run that by Carlos and get an idea of what we're looking at in terms of cost?
Right.
Where in my mind, the truth was, you just described $30,000, $40,000 worth of unnecessary stuff just because you think it'll look different.
Right.
But why am I going to fight that battle?
Right.
Most battles die of their own accord. You know what I mean? You leave them alone and there's not life to them.
And even in those situations, what I think is often helpful is to help people really think through their thinking. And I'm not saying this is specific for your wife in that situation, but a lot of times even just questioning. So that's great. I understand that probably would, how else would it impact your life? And if we think about that, what is the real impact? And is that something that's really meaningful to you? Because if it is, that's awesome.
Yes.
But a lot of times, like I'm not much of a car guy. I know a lot of guys are car guys, but I'll often go to think about I drive a car that's got 160,000 miles on it, and it pretty much runs the same as it did the day I bought it. So I'll think about going to get a new car, and I'm like, well, what am I doing? I'm going to spend $50,000, $60,000 in difference between the two costs.
Yes.
And a minute, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, for me, I'm not actually going to have anything I didn't have before.
That's right.
Someone else, if it's really important and you love cars, I'm not saying anything is wrong with loving cars. That's great. But for me, it doesn't move the needle.
Exactly.
And so I have to look at it and go, I'd be doing that for someone else.
Yes.
I'd be doing that so someone else goes, oh, look at John's new car. But I don't really care.
Exactly.
And so I think, slowing down and really getting our thinking, and again, in that space between stimulus response, thinking about what is the belief you have over here? What is it? Right. What's going on as it relates to that? One thing I want to make sure we touch on is the energy, right? Because as you said, I often feel pretty great about my being 60 and being capable of what I'm able to do.
Sure.
Feel pretty fit. You're 65. So, you're continuing that. You made that journey 5 years longer than I have and continue to stay super fit. How do you think that impacts the choices that you make as it relates to exercise, nutrition, sleep, avoiding toxins, et cetera? How has that impacted your ability to show up as a father, as someone in the community, as a leader of your business? Tell me a little bit of that.
Sure, you bet. Well, the genesis of my exercise addiction, it's a good addiction, is when I was 12 years old, I learned that most of the men on my mom's side of the family died of heart attacks before they ever reached 70. We had a history of heart problems, my mom included. So back before the internet, obviously, I researched what are the things you can do to try to minimize it. And well, we can't change our heredity, but we can influence it by our diet, exercise, what we take into our bodies, trying to eliminate. And so I got on that track. In my 20s, I didn't care about it because I was all over the map. But from 30s on, I've cared about it deeply. And the thing now that really informs what I do in my business is I work with a lot of successful past business owners, business executives, and I see very often they have very poor health. And there's a saying somebody told me so long ago that says, a young man will happily trade his health to gain wealth. And an older man will happily trade all of his wealth to regain his health. So I looked at that and I said, well, why ever lose your health in the first place? And there has to be a balance between health and wealth. Certainly I want to make a good living. I want a nice lifestyle for my family, but not at the expense of my health.
Right.
So I've always been.
And even if you look at it, it's kind of like the oxygen tank, right? You say, I want my family not at the expense of my health. But the truth is, if you don't have your health, you actually can't do those things.
Exactly.
So it's even from a selfish, non-selfish standpoint, right? In order for you to be the person that your advisor, your clients want you to be, and to be there so that as they continue to move through retirement, you're someone that's still there and has the energy to show up, and vibrantly be who you are.
Right.
All those things are delivered. Kind of funny. Today, I posted on LinkedIn, it was funny that I chose 65 was the year I actually chose.
Right.
And I said, think about the top 5% health and vitality 65-year-old. Like, try and picture that person in your mind.
Sure.
And then just imagine that was the average, right? Imagine that that's actually what you are experiencing.
Sure.
It's just the average. Like, how would that change our productivity as a society?
For sure.
The healthcare costs of society, right? The amount of pain and upset and misery and grieving.
Yes.
And again,
it's astronomical.
And it's nothing that's not available to almost everyone. I mean, there are some people that have certain things.
Sure.
But if we go back to, like, we were talking about genetics, well, what the most of the research is really showing now is we all have a, certain genetic makeup, but it's the epigenetics, right? It's what happens before that we either pull the trigger or don't. Right. So the trigger's there, the gun's loaded.
Right.
But depending on the choices that you make, either you pull that trigger or you don't. And so we make the choices and there are different things we can do. But really, if you eat well, you eat well, exercise, get some sleep, and don't take in poisons, you're in the top 5%, right?
That's right.
And then
you're halfway there.
And then even from an economic perspective, I do a lot of work with financial advisors as a coach. And one of the things I think is interesting, especially for people like yourself, like me, that have put ourselves in a position where we can choose how we're spending our time.
Right.
Most likely there's parts of your work, if you've been paying attention at all, you've geared yourself, moved yourself more and more and more toward doing the work you love to do.
Correct. Yes.
And so you think about it and say, okay, because you're in the fitness you're in today, I don't know how long you want to work, but you're capable of doing it for a long time. Right? Very, very capable of doing. And so even from an economic perspective, you look at it and you go, there's millions upon millions of dollars of generated income doing what you want to do.
And what gives you joy.
What gives you joy.
Yes.
And I mean, one of the greatest things is being a contribution, right? And when people cut themselves off from being a contribution, they go out and they play golf all day or they fish all day or they do something like that. And it's fun for a moment, and it's almost like they oversell it. You ever run into people like that? Oh my God, it's amazing. Let me tell you all the countries I've been to, and and you're like, you got anything deeper there for me? Again, I'm not choosing anyone else's lifestyle for them, but putting yourself in a position, right, where you're as vital and strong and healthy and vibrant as you are. I can easily see, if you choose to, you're doing this 75 to 80,
For sure.
And having fun and having great relationships.
Yes.
And what is the cost? The contribution is, but between now and then, I have to feel better and have more energy and do something I love. And if we're exercising properly in a way, like you do it like I do. I get into flow through exercise.
Yes.
Pretty much every day. Like get into this peak state of consciousness through exercise. And I'm like, okay, so one of the most fun things I do that pays all these incredible rewards. And somehow or another, we still haven't gotten that out there.
Yes.
So that, more and more people are going, oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a great book that's been out for years and been revised a number of times that I give to every one of my clients that's heading towards retirement. And it's a book called The New Retirementality. Instead of retirement, retirementality. And the author talks about how maybe just retiring 100% isn't the answer.
Right.
Maybe you shift gears and you now Maybe you do a lot of volunteer work. Maybe you work part-time. Maybe you change career focuses, but it's all on your terms in this quote unquote retirement period. And I think that is the best thing people can consider, because I have so many clients, particularly men who used to own businesses, who say to me, don't ever retire. Right. It's not what it's cracked up to be.
Right.
You can only play so much golf. You can only travel so much. You can only get dragged down to Bed Bath & Beyond with your wife so much.
And none at all anymore. Actually, they're gone, right?
Yeah, that's right. But you want to have a sense of purpose. And as you say, you want to be a contributor. You want to feel like you made a difference in somebody's life.
Yeah. And going all the way back to the beginning, the identity beliefs, what I was actually having a conversation with another of my clients earlier today, again, he's a financial advisor, so he deals a lot with this. And as you deal with a successful business owner or executive, and they've handled that purpose that they originally created, right? I'm going to be able to provide for my family. I'm going to create economic freedom and flexibility. Unless you go back and think about, okay, what's the overarching purpose? A lot of times that there's just not the juice in retirement.
Right.
Whereas if, whether it's community or, philanthropy, or sometimes I think what's wrong with staying in the business you're in?
Exactly.
Because there's a reasonable probability that you can add more value through the business you're in.
Sure.
And then choose to contribute in other ways. Not that you don't add time or whatever, but I think it's sometimes undervalued. The idea that you have an expertise that you've developed that you now get richly rewarded for. Yes, all the other stuff is really important too. And I think that sometimes that gets, I'm going to go do just charitable work.
Sure.
And then you don't find out the charity doesn't really need my specific gifts.
Right.
Or something along those lines, right? So really being conscious of that.
Yeah, and as the years go on, you're accumulating more and more wisdom and understanding, so that, like in my profession, investing in the stock market, what right now has some people on edge, ready to flee the market, whatever impromptu action, whatever whatever overreaction they come up with. My many years of doing this now informs me to be able to say to them, hey, relax, we've been here before.
Right.
And now give them perspective. So I think when you have 20, 30, 40 years in a profession, and then one day you decide I'm done with it, what do you do the next day?
Right.
And all of that knowledge and wisdom you have, don't you want to get that out there somehow? You want to.
Have you followed Ray Dalio as of late?
No, I haven't.
So, you know who he is, right?
For sure.
So
Bridgewater.
in case anyone's not familiar, Ray Dalio is the founder and chief investment officer, or was the chief investment officer for the largest hedge fund in the world, Bridgewater. And I guess over the last 5, 6, 7 years, he's really been transitioning out. And a little while back, he wrote a book called Principles of Work and Business. And his whole emphasis is to make sure he takes what he's learned and give it away.
Yeah, there you go.
His whole thing is thinking about what are the principles upon which you make decisions. And I think even more important about what are the principles, but what is the process that you have for uncovering the principles upon which, right? So that you can look at it and go, okay, in some ways, kind of like we're doing, what was the motivation, right? What did you do there that really enabled you either to have a great outcome with that particular employee or didn't work? Or how did you address it? Or who did you address? Or, and really getting clear. And one of the ways that I think, I'm one of my things is I want to help people age powerfully, brilliantly, and joyfully. And my perspective is when we leave the workforce, that often we're walking away from that. But the other thing that we're doing is if we look at our society, not the worst negative impression that you could possibly pick up watching a news show, but in truth, no matter what, there are some challenges that need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And like you said, there's so much talent and wisdom that you've accumulated. And it's almost like you take your ball and go home. Right. And you're like, oh, I got enough money. I'm going home.
Sure.
And you're like, well, wait, isn't there some stuff that you could still be adding value to? And again, I think it's having the clarity of like, here's where I really add value, and figuring out like, how are you going to lean into it? That doesn't mean you got, 60 hours a week you're committed to do forever.
Sure.
Go enjoy. But
right.
The 80-20 rule, if you were working 50 hours a week and we go 80-20 and you go, okay, 10 hours, like where's a really, really high level contribution of those hours where you're going to add as much value as possible and maybe mentor somebody, right?
Sure.
Or, so that when you walk away, whatever it was that you had continues. We all have this like legacy desire. The truth is like what you've learned and what you can share is a big part of the legacy.
Absolutely.
And
sure.
So I think that's a neat thing, that we're able to do.
I was fortunate back in about 15 years ago, I was invited by a gentleman to go on a trip to Peru. And there were 6 businessmen from around the United States. And honestly, at the time, I knew the only reason I was in the group was because he was my friend. All of these other guys were very successful people. And I felt like, I'm the least of this group. I went and did that, and it opened my eyes to the idea that even at my level, the knowledge I have when applied in other countries is like, Wharton School knowledge compared to that. So I went back to Peru on my own. I took an interpreter, went back for 10 days, and basically I counseled business people for the 10 days I was there. I went to their businesses and I took what I've learned about business through the years and I shared with them how they could implement it in their own businesses. And it gives me so much satisfaction to be able to do that. And, now I'm working with an organization that does that in Africa.
Right.
And I think I can't wait to get on a plane and go to Africa and take what's in this mind of mine. And really so much of it comes from, I have an inquisitive mind. So of my clients, I'm fascinated by how they gain success. So I learn from what they did right and what they did wrong, and I try to find somebody I can pass it on to.
Yeah. I remember doing Marcus Buckingham's work on strengths, like Strength Finders and things along those lines. And one of the things, he came out with a book after that called Standout, and they had taken the 34 different strengths and combined them in different ways. And one of the things they had was teacher. And they had inspirer, they had different things like those. And the things that I was like, oh, I want to be that. I want to be the inspirer, right?
Sure.
But I ended up being the teacher. And that was my dominant one.
Sure.
And what was interesting about the teacher, and it's kind of like what you're talking about, teachers are incredibly in order for it to flow.
Yes.
Right. What has to really happen is if I'm just learning.
Right.
And it stops here.
What good did it do?
Yeah. So the cool thing is like, as a teacher learner, you're like, I'm super inquisitive. I'm always learning. And then you're kind of like looking like, where's a great place? And one of the things that you said that I thought was awesome and that I think is important to think about is you went back to Peru to teach what you know.
Correct.
And a lot of times, again, we talked about a little bit in the charitable work, when you're going into charitable work or how are you going to contribute?
Right.
Sometimes people are like, I'm a team player. I'll do anything. What I think is more important is here's where I can really add significant value.
Yes.
Right. Here's where I can add significant value. And sometimes it's the leverage of the societal thing, right? You can say, even the dollars, right? The dollars I take, I go down, I share some information in Peru. I also drop some dollars there. Mm-hmm. And those dollars have a whole different impact than they have here as well. So I think leverage and understanding, leveraging our gifts, leveraging our resources.
Yeah. And I think that starts with really understanding who you are and what motivates you, what inspires you. Because one of the humanitarian aid projects I did was with the Navajo Indians in Arizona and New Mexico. And I went with a team of people that were going to be building a church and a medical clinic. And I said to the leader of this organization, I could certainly swing a hammer, but I can do you more good by going around the reservation, collecting stories of how lives have been changed by the work you do, and then I'll write about it.
Right.
And, God's blessed me with a gift with the written word. So as everybody got up in the morning, got out of their bunks and put on their work clothes, and they were going to go out in the hot sun for 12 hours pounding nails, I got in my rental car and had my camera, and I went all over the reservation day after day collecting stories. And I came back, and this gentleman had a monthly newsletter. So I wrote his newsletter that month, and the contributions poured in. So much so they said, I want you to write my newsletter from now on. And I said, well, we have to have a story to tell. But my point is, I was true to who I was.
Right.
Sure, hey, I could go help you build something,
Right.
and I'd make a little tiny contribution, but let me do what I'm passionate about and what I know is true to me, and let's see if it doesn't have a bigger impact.
Right. And so I love that. And I think that's an important place for us to think about professionally, as well as, in other areas, really slowing down to think about what is it that you really do that separates you? I've heard it talked about, like, there's 4 different zones of abilities: zone of incompetence, zone of competence, zone of excellence, and zone of genius. Right. And so of course we're going to stay out of our zone of incompetence, but even the idea of competence, like if someone else can do something as well as you can, it may be better and maybe faster and more efficiently, why would you spend any time doing that?
Right. Exactly.
And then many of us get stuck in the zone of excellence, which is like, people tell you you're good at it, you get rewarded for it, but it may not be that thing that really lights you up and that really is the greatest contribution. And I think that's the toughest place to, like, be in the zone of excellence.
Right.
And say, how do I even let go of some of that so I can go more and more and more into my zone of genius? Because if you find that, you're not going to want to walk away.
Sure.
When somebody wants to walk away, you kind of know that they didn't land in their zone of genius.
Sure.
Right. So I think that's awesome. And being aware, being self-aware, and knowing what your gifts are, and then also valuing contribution, so that you didn't go just saying, I'm going to check a box.
Right.
I went down to make a difference.
Exactly.
And I can make a bigger difference by doing this.
Yes.
Now, I also think there's another part of it of being willing to stand out, to be, I'm not everyone came down here and everyone else is choosing to do this, but I have enough understanding of who I am and enough confidence to really say, hey, you know what? I actually can make a greater contribution over there.
Right.
So those are things that I think would be really helpful for people to think about in their own lives,
Sure.
like really like owning your gifts. Sometimes when speaking to people, when I'm doing coaching work, especially when I start doing teamwork, they're almost like, I'm a team player.
Right.
I'm like, what do you really, when you think about it, like, I'm a team player, and I'm like, okay, but what really lights you up? Because that's where you're going to add the most value.
Exactly.
That's where you're going to grow the most.
Sure.
And it's almost like sometimes people are uncomfortable telling you what they're great at.
Right.
They may be even more comfortable telling you what they're not good at.
Sure.
But I have found for myself that for me, humility is understanding both sides of that coin. Like, I'm not great at everything. There's tons of stuff I'm not good at.
Yeah.
Most stuff I'm not good at, but there's certain things I'm great at.
Right.
And whatever those things are, it's not vain to know how you're wired.
Sure.
How you've been gifted, how you've been blessed, and how you've developed certain strengths.
Yes.
And those are the places, again, where I look at it. And if we think about the identity beliefs in the thermostat, I know that I can raise my thermostat. I can change the temperature a lot more when I stay plugged into places where I can add value rather than, I'm a cog in a wheel.
Yes.
And everybody, the other thing that's kind of interesting is, like, what you hate to do, somebody else actually loves to do.
Exactly.
And you're like, I can't give them all the shit work. And they're like, well, it's not chore for me.
Exactly.
Like
That's
I get
how
into,
they're wired.
Yeah, I get into flow. I get to look at a bunch of like I don't like data, you know.
Yeah.
I don't like to like look at all the details. And some people that's their thing.
Sure.
And so you look at it and you go, you know, does that really make sense?
Yeah.
So
Let me roll back to Marcus Buckingham. So I took the Strength Finder. At that time, I had a business where I had 40 employees, and I thought I was leader extraordinaire until I took the assessment and I found out leadership was probably 6 or 8 on my list.
Right.
It was such a wake up. But around that time, 2007, a friend invited me to a luncheon where some guys were going to be talking about, I don't know how to term it, but how to get more out of yourself, how to do better, have more energy and passion in what you do. I went along with it. And at that luncheon, a demonstration was made, a presentation was made that I was super impressed with. So I engaged one of those 2 guys to be my personal coach. And at the time I had this thriving business, and you know, this guy was new and starting out, so he charged me the most unreasonably low fee imaginable for this 6-month engagement. At the end of 6 months, he says, I just have one overarching question. And this is back in 2007. And I said, what's that? And he goes, why are you doing this? And I said, what do you mean? He says, I haven't heard the expression of getting any joy from it. I don't see that you're stimulated by it in any way. And I said, why am I doing it? I need the money. I have 3 kids in private school and a wife who's a stay-at-home mom. I need to make money. And he said, at what point will money not be your priority? At what point will your personal satisfaction and fulfillment and peace and joy be the primary motivator? And I said, I don't know, but I hope it comes. And it did come. And because of that person coaching me, I have the business I have today. I don't view what I do as work. So often I have clients call me on a Saturday and they'll apologize, and I'll say, I'm here in the office. This is what I do every Saturday because I love it. I love what I'm doing. I love the contribution I make to people. But I go back to that person helped me recognize the path I was on was one that was totally oriented to financial gain. It had nothing to do with my self-identity, my feeling of self-worth, my fulfillment in life.
Yeah. And your natural giftedness.
And my natural giftedness. And John, I thank you for being that guy. You were that person in 2007 who got me on the right path. And as you know, I've told many, many people that story since. Yesterday in the gym, my future son-in-law saw me talking to you, and he goes, who's that guy? And I said, that guy's the one who's had the single biggest contribution to my business life. He said, what? How could that be? And I said, he helped me to recognize I was on the wrong path.
Yeah.
And it took years later for me to shift to the right path. And, I thank God for you.
Well, I thank God for you as well.
Yeah.
And like just knowing that just lights me up, right? And I think that's why I do what I do.
Exactly.
So,
right.
that's my purpose, to help people like yourself find that passion. And then aside, making that passionate movement, you thrive financially anyway, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, what's interesting is when I made the shift, I sold my business, I made the shift. One day I'm making all this money and the next day I'm making zero. And my wife says, how are we going to do this? And I said, well, we're going to have to pull in our belts a little. We're going to have to operate with restraint. But the payoff is, I'm going to guess it's going to add 10 years to my life.
Right.
And she says, let's do it.
Let's do it. Well, anyway, I'm just so grateful for you being here. I'm really happy to have been in that spot at that time to have been able to make the impact. And as we always say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
That's right.
So thanks so much.
Truth.
Love to do it again sometime. And I really appreciate you being here today.
Indeed. Thank you, John, for everything you've contributed to my life.
Thank you, Alan.